On January 5th, 1955, my grandfather awoke at his post to a startling sight. Something was etched into the pulsing stone. He did not remember feeling tired. This was the first and last time that he ever fell asleep at his post, and he certainly did not remember there being anything written on the stone. Since the beginning of recorded time, there has been nothing written on the stone. Once fully awake, my grandfather bent carefully towards the stone to read what it said. Kill Seymour Black of Annapolis, MD. He alerted the other keepers via the red telephone bolted to the cavern wall. Within hours, all of the keepers were present, examining the stone. I dozed off for 3 minutes at most, my grandfather told them. He remembered glancing down at the arrangement of pebbles on the ground, moving in rhythm to the pulsing stone, which told the time. When I came to, the message was there. There was no protocol in place to address something like this. The keepers convened, absent my grandfather at first. Some held that he had etched the message himself, for some unknown reason. Perhaps in his former life, he had come to bad terms with this Seymour Black. But at length, the majority decided to bring him back into the fold as they worked together to figure out what had happened. It's almost as though the stone itself were telling us this, my grandfather said. We must at least investigate this Seymour Black of Annapolis, Maryland. And so the keepers were placed in the unprecedented position of tracking down a man that lived on the 7 continents. We have our various channels of connections, but are unaccustomed to being directly involved in the affairs of the world. Nevertheless, the keepers found themselves to be quite adept at detective work, and soon knew everything there was to know about Seymour Black. Namely, that he was a Nazi who had fled to America after World War II, and that he planned on assassinating President Truman at an opportune moment when he could gain access to what is now called a nuclear football. At the time, there were less safeguards in place as there are now. The keepers have been instrumental in the change. The man, who is now calling himself Seymour Black, planned on single-handedly starting a global nuclear war. He was eliminated. I know this, not because my grandfather told me, but because I've read it all in the log. My grandfather went mad and jumped off the highest cliff on the Pulsandum Island before I was born. After Seymour Black was killed, there remained the mystery of the message that is still, to this day, etched into the pulsing stone. But this was resolved a month later, if my grandfather is to be believed. He wrote it in the log. I remember I was the one who chiseled the message into the stone, but it was sometime in the future. After I wrote the message, I reset the pebbles to 1 month in the past. I am certain of it. It was well understood that resetting the pebbles which vibrated around the stone, and together with the stone, comprised the Pulsandum Clock, might reset time itself. The theory had long since stated that the clock did not merely report time, it created it. It was time. And so, resetting the pebbles, it was hypothesized, would reset time. There had been a centuries-long debate among the keepers about testing the theory out and attempting to reset time. On one side, the argument was that it was vital to understanding what exactly the clock was, and what time was, for that matter. On the other side, it was argued that it was far too dangerous. But in the end, both sides agreed that it would be a futile exercise. If they could reset time, how would they know that they had reset time? For all the keepers ever knew, They actually had reset time maybe several billion times, but they would never know it because it hadn't happened yet. My grandfather seemed to have resolved the debate by etching a message into the stone itself before resetting the pebbles. Because, according to the theory, the clock itself was time and contained all the past and all the future, but could only ever exist in the present. Then the message remained in the stone, even as time reset. As to why my grandfather took this extreme measure, quote, "I see it all so vividly now. Seymour Black succeeded. He started a nuclear war. I see the newscasts, the flesh melting away on camera, the piles and piles of bodies, the ceaseless screaming, the entire world. Nearly all of humanity dead. And when the newscast stopped, I saw it firsthand, on a mission to rescue our brothers and sisters trapped on the 7 continents. We failed, and I alone survived, the last of the keepers, and left their bodies to return to the Pulsandum Island." That was the last log entry that my grandfather ever recorded, and it was on the day that he hurled himself into the ocean. Last month, I awoke at my post to see another message etched into the stone. "Kill Frank Findlay of Fermoy Island." As we discovered, the man calling himself Frank Findlay had been working to develop a unique, highly contagious, and extremely fatal supervirus that he was planning to distribute around the world through a network of like-minded people intent on destroying humanity. He was eliminated. Then, the clock began to malfunction in terrifying ways. The keepers exist because when the clock stops, terrible things happen around the world. A half a second can mean a magnitude 9 earthquake in Chile, for example. 150 years ago, the clock once stopped for 6 seconds, and an entire portion of Europe simply disappeared. Nobody except the keepers know it was ever there. There have been many examples such as that. As to why the clock sometimes stops, it used to be the case that it was simply a physical disruption of the pebble's path around the pulsating stone. Perhaps a chunk of ceiling would fall to the ground, and the pebbles would be temporarily halted. The keepers were originally formed for 2 reasons. First, to clear the path as quickly as possible, as each millisecond of stoppage translated to human lives lost. And second, to study the clock and try to discover the secrets of time. Lately, however, over the past century in particular, the pulsing stone itself has begun to act erratically. It is strongly suspected that this is due to the interference from electrical grids, the byproducts of large-scale human production permeating the atmosphere, satellites and so forth. In a word, the effects of modern human civilization have likely been disrupting the stone. Although we are unsure of the exact causes, decades of experimentation has led us to a method of jump-starting the pulsing stone when it stops. We can make it work, though we are not sure why or how. Directly after Frank Findlay was killed, the pulsing stone stopped for 10 seconds. The keeper on the post tried the emergency procedure intended to restart the stone 3 times, to no avail. Cities all across the world disappeared, and mountains or barren lands replaced them. Hundreds of millions of lives were gone, as though they had never existed. All memories of these lands and people are gone, except for the carefully kept archives which are stored in the cavern that holds the Pulsandum Clock. The clock restarted of its own accord, but the problems continued. I am sitting here now, looking at a log recorded for the clock stopping for 35 seconds, with as yet unknown results. The entry is dated a month from now. That log entry stops abruptly, and on the next page, there is talk of a strange, ghostly howling heard all over the island. This is dated 5 years ago, and is clearly out of order. Nor do any other keepers remember reading about it. The keepers themselves seem unfamiliar to me. I do not remember them. They were different before. At first, I thought we had merely brought in some new ranks to attempt to address the new problems we were facing, but I haven't recognized a single keeper for a week now. Last night, I saw my grandfather. He has been dead for over 60 years, but I know what he looks like. I have studied the archives. He entered the cavern carrying a sledgehammer. "Grandfather?" I said. He walked over to the pulsing stone and lifted the hammer above his head. As per protocol, I had no choice but to shoot him in the head with my gun. When the body collapsed, I rushed over to drag it out of the path of the pebbles. We have been trained extensively to hold our emotions back until our duty is performed. Without that training, I would never have been able to react so methodically to the bizarre situation that I found myself in. However, in that moment, I discovered the limits of my training. As I dragged the body away, I looked down to see that it wasn't my grandfather that I had shot after all. It was me. I let go of my own dead body in shock as the pebbles began to bounce against it. The clock stopped. I stared in dumb shock, frozen, and began to hear a ringing in my ears. Then I heard shouting. 3 keepers had rushed into the cavern, and before I could process what was happening, I was being dragged away, alongside my own corpse. As a result of that incident, we have lost Patricia, New Zealand, population 932. Again, it is as though this place never existed, on Earth or in the minds of men. The only record that it was ever there is held in our archives. After the incident, I began having visions. I see it now. Frank Finley was successful in manufacturing his doomsday plague and spreading it across the world. I see men and women, children, bleeding from the nose, the mouth, the eyes, coughing, their skin turning pale, then blue, billions of them, all over the world. It happened. I saw it happen. In the so-called present day, the keepers have become even less recognizable. The faces look as though they are melting. Their features are dripping and blending together. They are moving slowly and have taken to kneeling silently around the pulsing stone, which keeps acting irregularly. I fear something terrible is about to happen. If this is not the end, then perhaps we wish it were the end. If you can read this, do what you must to make peace. Hug your loved ones if you are able. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, or if there will be a tomorrow.